well, go again. That's all we do. We just start and just go. So here we are. Now we left off that we were going to look at the election of 1824. Now this followed the 8 years of the presidency of James Monroe, and in those last 4 years, well actually for most of that time, the Republican Party had been the only real party, and the Federalist Party had just been fading away, and then it was just finally done in by its support for the Hartford Convention, which generally made the party look like it was anti-American, because they were talking about trying to get out of the war when we were just on the verge of this massive victory and this glorious celebration of how we really did well in the war, which is not true, but of course Americans like to celebrate and think that they're always just so great. And the victory at the Battle of New Orleans allowed them to do that, and so that made the whole war look like a great thing, and therefore it made the Federalist Party look like bad guys. So the Federalist Party, I think I told you they still had a candidate in 1816, but the party was just a bare almost nothing, and there really wasn't much to it. And they did get, I think, one vote or one state in the election of 1816. 1820, they're gone. So it's only one party. And a lot of times people refer to this time as the era of good feeling because there was no political partisanship. Well, that's a little misleading. What there was a lot of political dissension and division, but it was all within the Republican Party. And as we got closer to the election of 1824, there are about 5 Republicans who are being thought of as candidates for the presidency. 3 of them were members of President Monroe's cabinet. They were John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, who was the Secretary of State. He's the son of John Adams, and you remember John Adams had been a Republican, but his son, John Quincy Adams, had to be a Republican because there was no more Federalist Party to be in. So John Quincy Adams was a leading candidate, and he was sort of very popular in the North, where he was from. He was from Massachusetts. You know, the Adams family are from Massachusetts. And as Secretary of State, he had a very prominent role in the Monroe administration. Then there was also the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, who was from South Carolina and was very popular in the South. He was the Secretary of War. Another Southerner was the Secretary of Treasury, William H. Crawford, who was from Georgia. And he also was supported by a lot of the Southerners within the Republican Party. So there were those 3 members of the cabinet, all very prominent during the Monroe administration. And then, of course, there was Henry Clay, who was a member of the House of Representatives. And as I've told you, Clay is sort of the leading member of the House. He sort of had a lot of support within this House as the Speaker. And he was very prominent as the author or the advocate of the Republican program that we call the American System. And so he's also a very well-known member of the Republican Party, and comes from the House. So that's a very important position. And then the 5th Republican is sort of a newcomer onto the political scene, but a very famous American, and that was Andrew Jackson. He was famous, of course, for his involvement in the Battle of New Orleans, and was this great American hero because he was the great winner of the Battle of New Orleans. He was a member of the Senate, and as such he was in federal office, but he wasn't as well known from his service as were the other 4 candidates. So these are the 5 who were, as 1824 began, were all contenders for the presidency, all as Republicans. Early on, Calhoun decided to drop out. And he decided instead to run for vice president, figuring that that would be an easy thing to get, that there's all these people running to be president, but he'd be the only one interested in the vice presidency. And his strategy was to serve one term as vice president, and then after 4 years in that position to come back and run for president, but put it off for 4 years and hope that by 1828 the field would be a little bit more appealing and he would have a better chance. He was going to have a tough battle in 1824, so he just dropped out. But that still left 4. Now, the election of 1824 is important in a way in that for the first time we can really speak of a popular vote. The Constitution had left up to each state legislature the way they would choose their electors. The Constitution spelled out the membership in the Electoral College. Each state is going to have as many electors as it has representatives in the House, plus 2 for the Senate. And then after we amended the Constitution, it spelled the procedure by which the Electoral College would meet and vote and choose the president. And so that's all spelled out in the Constitution. But how each state chose its electors was left up to each state legislature. And in the early years, state legislatures kind of played games with this. The political process and the presidential elections were pretty messy because legislatures would tinker with the way that they chose their electors, and parties would try to game it and manipulate it. But overall, most state legislatures allowed the legislature to select the electors. And that was sort of the understanding of the original Constitution, that the electors would be chosen by state legislatures. But by 1824, most state legislatures have decided to let the people of their state choose their electors. And by this time, the term people has been expanded slightly from what it was at the time of the Constitution. Now, if you remember, at the time of the Constitution, the word people referred to landowners, and by definition, that meant white males. So when the Constitution was written, the forefathers, the people who wrote the Constitution, as I told you, were very leery about this term democracy. They wanted a republic. They were real committed to that. By a republic, they meant a government in which people elected representatives and the representatives governed. The people's role was limited to choosing their representatives, and the people meant only white male landowners. Well, that's changed slightly. That had evolved in those first decades of the country's history. And it's a gradual process. It's not one that you can necessarily document precisely. And it didn't take the same route in every state. Every state's a little bit different in how they went about this. But as a generalization, by 1824, the word democracy is no longer as feared as it had been in 1787. Americans have come to much more embrace the idea of democracy, and they have expanded the definition of the people. Well, sort of, a little. By 1824, generally, property requirements had been eliminated. They've been slowly and gradually been chipped away at over the years. States gradually changed the definition of a property owner, made it easier to qualify. Generally, the whole process of qualifying to be able to be a voter had been gradually slimmed down, and by 1824 it's all white males. Now, some of you may think, that's not really my conception of democracy, but it was for Americans at that time. That's the way they thought of themselves. They still were not ready to get outside of the white male fixation that had been part of America since the very beginning. But they have gotten away from the need to own property. They have universal white male suffrage, and they are now also in almost every state allowing the people, white males, to elect the electors, so that we can, for 1824, really meaningfully speak of a popular vote. Some states had sort of allowed it in the past, and then, then if they didn't want to, they'd change it the next year or something. And it had been played around with a lot, so it's kind of hard to generalize, but by 1824 you can generalize. States allowed the white males in their state to elect the electors, so that people got to vote, not exactly for the president, but they got to vote for the election, and they got to choose who their electors would be. So there's a popular vote. And in the popular vote, the winner was Andrew Jackson. Jackson got the most popular votes. He was number one. Number two was John Quincy Adams. Number three was Henry Clay. In the popular vote. But then as now, that does not elect the president. The Electoral College still elects the electoral vote, or still elects the president, I mean. So we have to look at not the popular vote, although Jackson won that. We have to look at the electoral vote, because that's what counts. And in the Electoral College, first place was Andrew Jackson. Same guy. He won both the popular vote and the electoral vote. In the electoral vote, second was John Quincy Adams. Third was William Crawford. And fourth was Henry Clay. Henry Clay came in last in the electoral vote. So Jackson won. But there's a catch. The Constitution required that a president have a majority over 50% in the Electoral College. And Jackson didn't have that many. He had the most, but he didn't have an absolute majority of the Electoral College. So then the Constitution says if no candidate has a full majority, then the House of Representatives will elect the president. It's no longer up to the Electoral College, it's now up to the House of Representatives. But the House members, the representatives, can vote for anybody that they want. They're not bound by who carried their district or anything like that. But they can only vote for the top 3 candidates from the Electoral College, which meant that it was going to be between Jackson, Crawford, and Adams. And so that's what the electoral does. It's only the top 3 vote getters, which meant that Henry Clay was no longer in the running. He'd been eliminated by the Electoral College because he came in fourth there. You have to be in the top three. But he's Speaker of the House. And so he has a lot of influence in the House. And to make a long story short, after a lot of manipulating and negotiating and behind the doors partisanship and political scheming and dealing and wheeling and so forth, the House announced that the president was going to be John Quincy Adams. And after that, Adams selected his cabinet. And then, as now, the most important office in the cabinet is Secretary of State. That's always been the leading cabinet officer. And he appointed as his Secretary of State Henry Clay. Well, some of you may be putting together what was going on here. Certainly, Andrew Jackson did. He understood what was going on. And he knew that he'd been cheated out of the presidency. He knew that there was what he called a corrupt political bargain, between Adams and Clay to cheat him out of the presidency that by many definitions he had won. He got the most popular votes, he got the most electoral votes, but he didn't win the presidency. So, as you can imagine, he was irate. He spent the next 4 years plotting for the election of 1828. He spent his time doing political organizing. He organized a political party with all kinds of different levels, state organizations, county committees, even local committees. He recruited people to serve in all of those positions. He spent a lot of time raising money. He established newspapers to serve as pure Jacksonian newspapers, just to be very politically biased newspapers to present his side of the story. And he's appealing to a wide range of people to vote for him in 1828. And he had a big party organization. One of his closest lieutenants was from New York. Jackson, remember, is from Tennessee, so that makes him a Southerner and sort of a Westerner. He recruited Martin Van Buren of New York as sort of a leader in the Northeast to be his almost like his loyal lieutenant. And Van Buren was a very good political organizer. Historians sometimes debate about who was the real political genius of the party that Jackson is organizing. And some people say that it was Jackson himself, some say it was Van Buren. They were both very skillful political maneuverers and organizers, and they put together this real successful organization. Initially, they called it the Democratic Republican Party. They're still sort of holding on to the idea that they're the Republicans, that they're still the heirs of Thomas Jefferson and the whole Republican Party. So they still use that word Republican, but they call themselves the Democratic Republican. And eventually, in a few years down the line, they would just drop the word Republican and just call themselves the Democratic Party. And they were very successful. Poor old John C. Calhoun had hoped to be able to serve one term as vice president and then be somehow the obvious choice for president in 1828. Well, he's been totally passed by the Jacksonians. So he agreed to serve another term as vice president. He was the vice president under Adams, and then he's running for vice president with Jackson and running against Adams. The election of 1828 was simpler. It was just two people, both of whom still were calling themselves Republicans. As I told you, Jackson was calling himself a Democratic Republican. Andrews was calling himself a National Republican, emphasizing the national aspects of his version of the Republican Party. So the situation where we had a kind of a free-for-all in 1824 has been back to kind of the standard two-party system, and it's Jackson versus Adams. And in the election of 1828, Jackson accomplished his goal of winning a clear majority in both in the popular vote and the electoral vote, so that his enemies, Jackson and Clay, couldn't. Adams and Clay. He's Jackson. So Adams and Clay couldn't conspire against him as they had done in 1824. He just simply won a clear election. So Jackson became the president then, officially inaugurated in 1829. I want to look at the work of the Jackson administration now. And Congress is still passing laws, and Congress was still led by Henry Clay. So Clay is still trying to accomplish the purposes of his American system, which I talked about before, and you understand that it's the idea of a strong federal government trying to promote economic growth, which was, as of 1828, was fully underway and was just doing extremely well. And remember the three components of the American system: the idea of internal improvements at federal expense, the idea of the second bank of the United States, and the idea of tariffs to protect American manufacturing. So let's look at what's going to come out of Congress. In 1832, Congress passed another one of the federal internal improvements. It was called the Maysville Road. This was to be a road connecting Lexington, Kentucky, with Maysville, Kentucky, on the river. Now see, Lexington was an internal city. It had no waterways, so there's no steamboats or canals going to Lexington. So at one time, early in the history of Kentucky, Lexington had been the leading city. It's the most prominent city in Kentucky. But by the 1820s, with steamboats playing an increasingly important role, and thus the Ohio River playing a very prominent role, Lexington had been passed by Louisville, which was on the river. And Louisville was a major river port served by all of the steamboats. And Lexington is just kind of out of the loop, sitting up there in the mountains. So the city fathers of Lexington had proposed, and Clay has endorsed, a bill to build a road from Lexington to Maysville, which was on the river. And the idea was that Maysville could develop as a port, that it could serve by the road, it could serve Lexington, and that Lexington could remain a thriving city in the age of modern transportation, with all the emphasis on all of its canals and waterways and so forth. So Congress passed a bill for the federal government to build the Maysville Road, linking Lexington and Maysville. And this is part of the whole concept of the American plan, the American system that Clay has made sort of the foundation of the Republican Party, the new Republican Party. And Andrew Jackson vetoed it. And he pointed out, this is a road entirely within Kentucky. So if the people of Lexington or whatever, if they want a road, the proper agency to build it would be the state of Kentucky. And what Jackson is saying here then, we don't want this big federal government, we want state governments. He's kind of a throwback to the old Republican Party, the party of Jefferson and Madison, like back in the 1790s, when they wanted the idea of emphasis on state governments. And that's what Jackson's saying. So, you know, the party, the Republican Party has sort of, it's expanded. It's the only party, but it's got sort of like, to simplify, two wings, one of which is now being led by Clay, which is really more like the old Federalist Party, and then another one now led by Jackson, which is more of the classic traditional Republican Party. It's one of a strong federal government under Clay, or an emphasis on state governments, state sovereignty, as advocated by, you know, the Jackson wing of the party, the Democratic Republican wing, not the national wing, led by Clay. And in fact, as it turned out, Clay could get a majority in Congress to pass the Maysville Road bill, but he couldn't get the 2/3 majority to override the veto. So the Maysville Road did not get federal support. So Jackson is showing that he's really a different kind. He's the traditional kind of Republican. He's the old-fashioned kind of Republican, not the new kind of Republican, as with Clay and all of the so-called national Republicans. Emphasis on the national government. All right, so that was one of the programs of Clay that Jackson vetoed and ended. The second one, remember, was the Bank of the United States. The bank had been chartered in 1816 for another 20 years. That was what the first one was. It's a 20-year charter. And in its early years, the bank kind of didn't do a very good job. In 1819, it had allowed state banks to expand way too much. State banks started printing up a lot of money without any kind of restraint or control from the Bank of the United States. And they did what I told you is the great danger of banking. They printed so much paper money, and eventually it was obvious that they simply didn't have the gold to back it up. So people started trying to redeem that currency, and the banks failed. There was a massive wave of bank failures, which we call the Panic of 1819. It's like an old-fashioned version of a depression, but it's much more characterized not by high levels of unemployment. The United States really was not yet a major industrial nation, although we're industrializing, but we're still overwhelmingly agrarian. No, it's not exactly the same thing as a modern-day depression. So we don't use the word depression, we use the word panic, because it was mostly characterized by banks failing, by people panicking and trying to get their money out of the bank before it closed, and many of them failing, most of them coming too late, and the bank's gone, and so is all their money, all their investment. And they hold all of this currency, which has now become worthless. The bank no longer exists. So, and that was really the fault of the Bank of the United States. It just didn't do a very good job. After that, the bank got a new president, and I think I gave you his name earlier. His name was Nicholas Biddle. And Nicholas Biddle was a much better banker. It's kind of complicated, the things that he did, but in general, by the 1820s, the Bank of the United States was doing a very good job of what I talked about before, striking a good balance between the desire to, allow paper money. You want paper money out there so businesses can get loans, and farmers can buy land and equipment, and the country can experience economic growth, and it was working. The country was growing very well economically. The country is in an economic boom. But the money is regulated closely enough so that it's not crazy stuff. The money is still sound. It's basically got enough solid gold backing that people can have confidence in it, and the system works, and the banks work, and the money system is working well, and it's part of our great economic prosperity of the 1820s. And much of the credit goes for that to Biddle and the bank. So by 1832, nearing the end of Jackson's first term of office, Biddle, who worked closely with Clay, Clay was the sort of the author of the American system, with the bank is a big part of that. And the two of them basically decided, you know what, this is maybe, the bank is going to be very popular because the economy is doing well, and maybe this would be a good time to renew the charter. Now remember, the charter is going to run until 1836. It had been issued in 1816 for 20 years. But Biddle and Clay said, well, let's not wait till 1836. Who knows what the economy is going to be like 4 years from now? Let's strike while the iron is hot. Let's get the charter renewed now and extend it. It's not close to expiring. So let's just, I don't think if you call it renewing or extending it, let's renew it for 20 years in addition to its original time, which means it'll run from until 1856. Let's add another 20 years onto the charter of the bank. Let's just extend it for another 20 years. And they're taking advantage of the fact that the bank is very popular. And sure enough, Congress voted for that extension. Congress approved the bank's extended charter. And that's part of Clay's whole program. And once again, Andrew Jackson said, veto. He vetoed it. And why? He went through some of the same arguments that had been raised against the bank when it was first proposed back in 1791. The bank's charter is unconstitutional because by the whole concept of strict construction of the Constitution, classic Jeffersonian republicanism, which I told you Jackson is a classical Jeffersonian Republican. He's the old-fashioned kind of Republican. And he believes in strict construction of the Constitution, and the Constitution does not include any words about a bank or a charter or a corporation, so Congress cannot issue that charter. And so on that basis, he vetoed it. Well, by this time, we've sort of changed our original idea about who decides on constitutionality. And we've now recognized the idea that the Supreme Court can declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. Now, I hadn't talked about this, and I had just because I got so involved in other things, I sort of overlooked it, because there had been an important development in 1802 in the early days of the Jefferson administration. When John Adams was defeated in the election of 1800, and he's going to be out of office as of March 4th, 1801, he, in those last days of his administration, appointed a number of federal judges who served for life. And they all had to be approved by the Senate, but they all were, because the Senate was still controlled by the by the Federalists. The election of 1800 had been a victory for the elections, for the Republicans, Adams had lost the presidency, and the Federalists had lost their majority in Congress, but they were still sitting there, and Adams was still president. So as sort of a last ditch to kind of keep the Federalist Party alive, he appointed a number of judges in the last minutes, well, last days of his administration. And they were all approved by the Senate before their term of office expired. Many of them have lost their positions, and the Federalists no longer have a majority in the Senate, but they're still there because the transition hasn't officially taken place. One of those was a new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. His name was John Marshall. John Marshall became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1801. And he served until 1835. He is still the longest serving Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that we've ever had. There have been a couple of associate judges who have had longer terms than his, 34 years or whatever it was, but no Chief Justice has served as long as John Marshall. And no Chief Justice has dominated the Supreme Court as strongly as John Marshall did. Marshall had, there were 4 other judges, but he usually totally overwhelmed them. He argued so strongly, he was such a brilliant attorney, that he just convinced everybody and the other judges, and they came and went during his long tenure, but he just dominated all of them. He ran the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was John Marshall. And during all of that time, although during those years the Federalist Party sort of faded away and then disappeared, he remained a committed, old-line Hamiltonian Federalist. Ironically, he was a cousin of Thomas Jefferson, but he was definitely a political opposite from Jefferson. He was a strong Federalist. And a case came before him, which is very complicated, and I don't want to take the time to give you all the details of this case. But this was a case of Marbury versus Madison. Marbury was another one of those last-minute judges. The Republicans called them the midnight judges because the idea was that some of them were being rushed through in the last day up until midnight of the last day of Adams' term. It's not quite literally true, but they were all very late in Adams' term. And one of them was a guy named Marbury, John Marbury, or William Marbury. But he was a really lower level judge. He was not like a Supreme Court judge like Marshall. And in the rush to get things done, the Senate approved his appointment, but the Secretary of State for Adams wasn't able to do the last step, which is a formality, is to deliver the commission. That's a formality that has to be done. It's only a formality. It's only a technicality. Marbury had been appointed by President Adams, and his appointment had been confirmed by the Senate, but the technicalities hadn't been finished, and without those, he couldn't take over. And the new Secretary of State who came in, the Secretary of State is sort of officially the one who does sort of the official work of the federal government, including officially signing and administering the commission of it's called the formal commission. It's a formality. And the new one, Madison, wouldn't do it. He just said, no, that was the old administration. I'm in the new administration. I'm not going to do this, even though Marbury had been officially approved and his appointment had been approved by the Senate. So Marbury sued Madison to order him to deliver his commission. And Marshall then made a decision in this case of Marbury versus Madison, and he said, first of all, Marbury is entitled to be appointed as a judge. The Constitution was complied with Constitution says he has to be appointed by the president, and the appointment has to be confirmed by the Senate. That was done. If somebody is blocking that, he's entitled to go to courts and get relief. But what Marshall said, and this is kind of ironic because this is a Federalist with before him a case of a fellow Federalist suing a Republican, but he says the Federalist can't do it in the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court can only be a court of appeal. It can't be a court of what they call original jurisdiction. So Marbury has to go through a process of first applying in a lower federal court, and then if he loses there, he can go to an appeals court, and if he loses there, then he can go to the Supreme Court. But he can't start in the Supreme Court because the Constitution says that the Supreme Court can only be an appellate court. And Marbury was basing his case on an act of Congress that had set up the Supreme Court and had set up the whole federal judicial branch, and it had granted the Supreme Court the power to issue the writs of the orders that he was asking, the court order. But Marshall said that law, even though it's sort of ironic because he was serving under that law. He was one of the judges that had been provided for in the Judicial Act of 1787 or of 88, and he said the law was unconstitutional. So John Marshall has established, in the case of Marbury versus Madison, the power of the Supreme Court to declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. Now, I told you that that's been around ever since the Constitution was written, but people hadn't really understood it. And I think I told you our first Chief Justice, John Jay, didn't really quite get it. And that's why he didn't realize how important the Supreme Court could be, and that's why he resigned to go off and negotiate a treaty with England. So it's only now that Marshall is Supreme Court Justice that it's become clear that this is a power of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court had then been called upon in 1819 to declare the Bank of the United States unconstitutional. There was a case called McCulloch versus Maryland. McCulloch was an official of the Bank of the United States. The state of Maryland didn't like the bank, and so the state legislature of Maryland had passed some laws imposing heavy taxes on the bank branch in Baltimore. The Bank of the United States had branches around in many American cities, including in Baltimore and Maryland. And the Maryland legislature had sort of tried to close down that branch of the Bank of the United States by taxing it very heavily. That's a state law. But Marshall had ruled that that state law was invalid because Congress had created the Bank of the United States. And the Bank of the United States was constitutional. Marshall, as a Federalist, is adopting the whole Hamiltonian theory of implied powers, of a greater federal government, of a more powerful federal branch of the federal level of government. The traditional Hamilton versus Jefferson, Jefferson straight construction, Hamilton implied powers, which we talked about earlier and which I hope you all grasped. And Marshall, as a classic Federalist, even though by 1819, when that case was decided, the Federalist Party's gone, but Marshall was still Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he's still following Hamilton's ideas of implied powers, and implied powers meant that Congress had a constitutional right to establish the Bank of the United States, and the state of Maryland cannot, as a state, cannot overrule a federal law. So that's the difference there. That's the whole idea that we're trying to decide that whether we're a federation of states, and in which case Maryland would have the superiority and could get rid of the Bank of the United States, or we're a single nation, in which if Congress decides that that we're going to have a bank, we're going to have a bank. And Marshall upheld the single nation theory, what I've called, to simplify it, the Hamiltonian idea. And he's an updated version of the Hamiltonian philosophy. And as a Federalist, he's saying the bank is constitutional. So there is a decision on the constitution of the bank. There had been a big debate over it in 1791, but when the first bank was established, it's been argued about ever since, but the Supreme Court has settled the issue. The Bank of the United States is constitutional. And here's Jackson saying, I'm going to veto it. I don't care. I don't care what John Marshall says. I'm the President of the United States. I have to decide if a bill is constitutional or not. Congress has passed a bill. It's my job as President to decide if I'm going to pass it, or if I'm going to sign it, I'm going to veto it. I have to decide for myself. I have to make this decision because the Constitution says that I'm the person who signs it or not. If I decide that it's unconstitutional, I'm going to veto it. And so I'm going to veto the bank. Supreme Court doesn't, so who cares? Doesn't matter. President has vetoed it. So Jackson has once again asserted this whole classic Jeffersonian Republican principle, the old style Republicans, that is based on states' rights, state supremacy. The federal government cannot just establish the Bank of the United States. It's up to states, and only states, to establish banks. We can only have state banks. We can't have a Bank of the United States. So we've got it pretty clearly now that the classic difference between the Federalists and the Republicans that had started back in the 1790s is alive and well. And it's just now that Clay has sort of taken the place of Hamilton, and Jackson has taken the place of Jefferson, even though they both call themselves Republicans. But it's really Jackson who's the classic Republican. Clay is really much more of a Federalist and a Hamiltonian, and with his idea of a strong federal government, including the Bank of the United States. But Jackson is the president. The bank was vetoed. And the bank still existed. Its charter was still good until 1836. But after the defeat of the renewal, Jackson started pulling Federal Reserves out of the Bank of the United States and putting them in state banks. And so when the charter expired in 1836, the bank was down to a skeleton of its original self. The whole bank had sort of failed, and it couldn't even operate because Jackson continued to attack its operations. Okay, so that leaves the whole issue of tariffs. Well, the issue of tariffs is going to be the most complicated and the most troublesome to understand, and so I'm struggling to try to stay on target here, and I'm having a hard time because these issues are so complicated. The tariff is the most complicated of them all. I told you that in 1816, as part of sort of the first steps of the new Republican Party with Clay and so forth, Congress had passed a high tariff in 1816. At that time, the tariff was pretty much of a sectional issue. The members of Congress who were voting on it pretty much line up along sectional lines as to whether they're pro or anti-tariff in 1816. The Northeast, the sort of the commercial area of the country, was really divided over the tariff. And so it's not unified. Some congressmen from the Northeast, from New England and the other northeastern states, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, whatever, some of them were still supporting the sort of the old economic basis of the area, which is based on trade, merchants. That had been the classic economic powerhouse of that region, the merchants and their shipping and trade and so forth. And see, a tariff could reduce the total volume of trade. It's designed to reduce imports, and that might mean less business for merchants. So there are politicians in the Northeast who were sort of aligned with the merchants, and they were anti-tariff. But there's some merchants, I mean some of the economic wealthy people of that area are aligned with the sort of the coming thing, which is industrial manufacturing. And so they supported the tariff as part of their effort to have manufacturing. So there's a question here of whether the United States is going to be a classic nation just relying on trade, or if we're going to start having a manufacturing base of our own. And that was particularly true in the Northeast, which was really divided on the subject of the tariff. If we look at the West, the issue is much clearer. Westerners didn't want to have to rely on imports. They don't have ports. They don't have access to the ocean directly. Not in 1816 when the Erie Canal is not open. But Westerners are almost 100% pro-tariff. The West is very pro-tariff, and they definitely want to have manufacturing in the United States so that we don't rely on foreign imports. That a lot of that's going to be in the Northeast, but that's more accessible than European ports, and a lot of it might be in the West itself. The West might start to be able to develop into have a manufacturing region, have some manufacturing within the region if there's protection of tariffs. So the West is very pro-tariff. The South was strongly anti-tariff. The South is still agricultural. It's not yet given over totally to cotton, as it's just barely started the sort of the transformation to cotton, but they still have definite agricultural products, and they want to export those. They feel that we need to have imports to pay for those exports. They want to keep the United States as an agricultural nation. I mean, the South is agricultural. There's no manufacturing down there. So the South is strongly against the tariff. So you can kind of look at a map of the country. If you looked at the states and saw how their congressmen voted on the tariff, the South is strongly anti-tariff. The West is strongly pro-tariff, and the North is divided. With one exception. The one exception, and it kind of stands out, is the state of South Carolina. One southern state which was totally pro-tariff. The South is, if you did a, red and blue and say red are pro-tariff and blue is anti-tariff, the South is all red, and then here's this blue island in the middle of it, South Carolina, that's totally pro-tariff. And South Carolina's, both of their senators and all of their congressmen voted in favor of the tariff, whereas almost every other Southern congressman voted against the tariff. So it's really weird. South Carolina is not like the rest of the South. And the reason is simple. South Carolina felt that they could become an industrial state. They expected to be industrial because they look and they say, wait a minute, to the extent that industry is developing, this country is developing in New England, but that doesn't make sense because the cotton is grown here. We're close to the raw material. We're the logical place to have manufacturing. So it just only makes sense that with the cotton being grown here, that the textile industry should develop here. Now I told you there were reasons why it went up to the New England instead. One was the availability of capitalists to invest in textile mills. Well, South Carolina has the city of Charleston. It's the only real city in the South, but it's a long-time city, and it's got a long-time core of capitalists who have accumulated wealth that could be used to invest in textile mills. Charleston is just like a smaller version of Boston with a core of wealthy investors, potential investors in manufacturing. And so Charleston, they have the manufacturing there. Then I mentioned the issue of a source of power, and that the textile mills that are being built are all being built in New England where there's water power. But Charleston says, wait a minute, this is 1816. We've got steam engines. We can use steam engines. We don't need to be limited by water power and by the sites of water power. We can build a steam engine. We can put a steam engine anywhere. We can have a textile mill anywhere, and we're going to have those down here in Charleston and in South Carolina. And then the third issue that New England had that enabled them to have the textile industry there was the availability of cheap labor. Teenage girls, farm girls on families that were poor and needed to have their daughter go out and get a job to support the family. There's that labor supply, cheap labor in New England. South Carolina says, wait a minute, we've got a cheap source of labor. We've got slaves. We can have slave labor. We don't need to rely on farm girls. So we've got the same advantages that New England has, but in addition, we've got access to the raw material. So we're going to become the great industrial center. Charleston is going to, or South Carolina is going to become a great industrial state. We're going to support the tariff as part of our whole support of industrialization because we're going to be a leading industrial nation, or an industrial state. So we're going to leave it there. I'm out of time. We're going to have to come back in our next class and look at what's going to happen in Charleston with its great faith in industrialization and its ability to become a great industrial state, and therefore its support for tariffs. Now, for your little question for the lecture, let me ask you to write on what was the bill that Jackson vetoed that would have provided for federal support for an internal improvement.